Good morning. Good morning. I know this is a changeover from your regular schedule, but we moved the session on the changing landscape of higher education now, so they stay on schedule. I'm Bob Messina. I'm president of Burlington County College in New Jersey. That's southern New Jersey. First thing, as a courtesy, we ask all that cell phones be turned off. Today's session is on the changing landscape of higher education. As trustees and presidents, we need to understand the shifting dynamics of higher education field in order to guide our institutions to maneuver effectively through it. We will hear from two distinguished speakers who have extensive knowledge about this topic through their experience covering higher education issues for major print publications. Both have covered the for-profit school industry in depth, and we have asked them to talk specifically about their impressions of how this sector is treated by the media and what related issues they have presented for nonprofit higher education. We also want to know if they offer our own institutions any lessons. I'm pleased to introduce our panelists. Goldie Blumenstyk is a reporter and editor at the Chronicle of Higher Education, and she has covered topics touching every corner of higher education, including distance education, the internet boom and bust, state politics, university governance, fundraising. Goldie is nationally known for her expertise on for-profit higher education, college finances and university patents, and the commercialization of academic research. Before joining the Chronicle, she covered politics and government for the Orlando Sentinel in Florida. Our second speaker this morning is Jennifer Epstein. She covers national politics and education for Politico. Before joining the magazine, Jennifer covered Congress, the U.S. Department of Education, for-profit colleges, and other federal education policy for Inside Higher Ed. Prior to joining Inside Higher Ed, she covered the 2008 elections and politics around the clock for Time magazine. She was managing editor of the Daily Princetonian, a position she held after winning several awards for reporting and is writing as a senior writer for the paper. This is an important topic. The Secretary of Labor just commented on thinking beyond the box, and one of the challenges I know for our college is the rise of the for-profit colleges within your service area. And this is called competition. So I think this would be a really, really important topic for presidents and trustees. So please join me in welcoming Goldie and Jennifer. Which one wants to go first?
Why don't I start? I guess I can start.
Okay.
Yeah. Morning, everybody.
Morning.
Can barely see you all out there.
Stand by the mic.
No, I think I'd rather sit down if that's okay. We'll go with the cash look today.
Okay.
I thought we'd start out, Jennifer and I have been covering this, this issue in a particularly interesting time, and so I thought I might take a minute and just set the stage a little bit. I know a lot of you are very familiar with the topic, but for some of you who are newer trustees perhaps, and you might not be as familiar, I thought we're going to talk about this changing landscape primarily from the point of view of the rise of the for-profit sector, which I've actually been covering at the Chronicle for, well, about 15 years on and off. This has certainly been the most interesting year that I've been covering it. For those of you who are familiar and those of you who are not, the sector sort of began, the modern history of the sector sort of starts in the 90s when a lot of the companies had IPOs and went public and started trading on Wall Street. That was sort of one period of growth. In 1992, the Education Department eased up some standards on recruiting. These are called these safe harbors that some of you may be reading about now, which was another spurt for growth in the sector. There was an adoption of the 50%, the elimination of the 50% rule, which is another mark in the history of the sector, which allowed more colleges, your colleges and others, to offer more distance education courses. In the mid-2000s, another trend that affected the for-profit sector, not your sector as much, is of course the rise of private equity interests in the for-profit sector. These are investor groups that have come in and bought up colleges expecting a very high rate of return. And that's fueled a lot of the growth in the sector as well. And in some cases, people would argue it's fueled some of the negative factors of the growth. And what we've now seen basically since 2008 with the Higher Education Act and then the regulations that the Obama administration has been proposing is we're now kind of in the era of re-regulation and what we've come to see as sort of a reset in the sector. Honestly, there are changes happening in the for-profit sector now that would not have been envisioned even 6 months ago.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if you look at what's happened at the University of Phoenix just since August, they've really changed their recruiting tactics, and then they've stopped incentive compensation, which is the whole idea of paying admissions people per head, which is something that at nonprofit colleges just doesn't happen, as you all know. And there's really just been this huge kind of shift in just since the summer, really, as Congress got more serious in looking at the for-profit colleges, and as it became incredibly clear that the Education Department was going to go forward with some kind of tough regulations on incentive compensation. And then, you know, the big elephant in the room is this thing called gainful employment, which I'm guessing that a lot of you have probably heard at least a little bit about. And it's basically this set of these regulations that would create metrics tying student debt levels to student achievement levels by looking at, you know, how your repayment rate for student loans connects what level that is, and, you know, those kinds of things, which are certainly not an issue for the community colleges because of your, you know, pretty low lending percentage of students who take out student loans. But it does kind of get at this bigger question of, you know, quality and value, which are the questions that everyone in higher education is grappling with right now.
One thing about the gainful employment, even though you might not run afoul of it because of your price point, I think you still have to abide by it. And so
Right.
you're still going to have to come up with the same calculations that for your career-focused
Right.
programs. And so it's still an issue for you.
Which is something that AACC, I think, in its comments on the regulations at various points in the regulatory process has talked about is, you know, this is an undue burden that's really not going to affect, that we really shouldn't have to deal with because, you know, it affects such a small number of students that we have. And, you know, generally when a student takes out loans at community colleges, it's because of, you know, extreme life circumstances rather than because they can't afford, you know, the you know, couple $100 or $1,000 tuition.
One of the other things that's happening in this, in what we're calling the reset, what do I call the reset? I don't know if anyone else is calling it that yet.
A lot of people are.
Okay. Then what we're all calling the reset. The companies are adopting to some degree, and I'm saying only to some degree, a sort of a slower growth pattern. Phoenix, as Jennifer mentioned, has changed its incentive compensation plan. They've also introduced a new free orientation program, and it's intended to be somewhat of a screen. Similarly, Kaplan has introduced a program where they're letting students take 2 classes, I think, for free.
Right.
And the idea is that they've realized that they've been enrolling a lot of students who can't do that well at their colleges, and they're dropping out. And so primarily because of the impending regulation and for their own financial interests, a lot of these companies are sort of changing. I was at Phoenix a few weeks ago, and one of the parts of their new strategy is they've now realized that they created they used to have a big program they called ACCT College, which was aimed at which was sort of like a 2-year college. And what they realized is that they had started to compete with what used to be their best model. Their old model used to be to take the best students coming out of community colleges as transfer students into the University of Phoenix, and instead they created this other model which tried to compete with the community college and in effect go after students who were the least prepared. And there you're going to see a great cutback in that effort at the 2-year college level at Phoenix, which means I think that you'll probably be hearing from University of Phoenix more so than you have in the past about articulation agreements and the like. Whether you want to or not, you're going to probably be hearing from them, as well as from many of the other colleges. You're also going to be seeing them competing a lot more for other sources of revenue out there. A lot of the colleges are bumping up on the rule in the for-profit sector that prohibits them from getting more than 90% of their revenue from Title IV sources. So that's one of the reasons you're starting to see a lot more for-profit colleges go after military students, because that money doesn't count, going after corporate programs, which is, I know, a big area for community colleges, and I suspect WIA money as that gets developed, because they also realize that the WIA legislation is going to be reenacted soon, and I think they see that as another opportunity to break through the 90-10. area.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing that you have to think about in terms of thinking about how your institutions match up with for-profits is that the for-profits all have tons of highly paid lawyers and lobbyists working for them, and those people are out there figuring out how to get every dollar out of the federal government for their purposes, whether it actually serves students or not. And you know, that's their business model, and it's smart from their point of view, but what it may mean for your institutions, especially with one of the ideas that President Obama proposed yesterday in his budget, which is sort of a race to the top for post-secondary education, which, while it's a small program in his proposed budget and may never actually come into fruition because there probably won't even be a budget with the way that things are going, it's still a possibility that's floating out there, this idea of competition in higher education. And it's the same thing that you all have, you know, started to deal with, you know, Gates and Lumina grants, and this may just be, you know, kind of the federal government as grant giver in another way.
I want to talk a little bit about what's next on the horizon coming up sort of politically in this area. One other trend that's kind of broadly on the landscape that I've been finding kind of fascinating is really over the past 10 years, we'd seen this trend, a small trend, but it was sort of significant, of sort of small, regionally accredited, but financially troubled nonprofit colleges being acquired by for-profit entities, and then a lot of them have been using those colleges and their accreditation to build up kind of giant distance education enterprises. Ashford University, Grand Canyon University, there's a few of these other ones out there. These are now giant distance education companies that kind of had their roots in the small nonprofit conversions. That trend has seemed to have, the door slammed on that recently, and what we've seen in the last few weeks was actually a reverse trend. Now some for-profit colleges are converting to nonprofit status, to some degree to escape some of the new regulations, and to some degree to hear people tell it they're a little concerned about the growth demands that maybe a private equity investor would have for them, so they're looking for another direction. Those of you in Florida know that Kaiser University, that same company, college company that had sued the community college in Jacksonville, that's one of the colleges that has just recently converted to nonprofit status. So that's I don't know, in journalism we always say 3's a trend, and I only know of 2 so far.
Yeah.
So it's not yet a trend, but maybe it's an emerging moment here.
Right.
So what's next on the horizon?
Well, one thing that was supposed to be happening this week and has gotten pushed back a little bit is a Senate hearing from the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee chaired by Tom Harkin. And throughout the summer and early fall, held a series of hearings on the for-profit colleges, on their recruiting tactics, on their business models. And that's kind of been a time in which the for-profits have actually gotten a lot of media attention because Harkin's staff has been really good in getting, you know, ABC to do a story off of it, and you know, and ABC will, you know, not just run it, you know, for one show. They'll have it on Good Morning America. They'll have it on the evening news. They'll have it on Nightline, and so those kinds of things, especially when they're coming from, you know, Harkin's office, and he's a Democrat, and he's very critical of the for-profits, those are not going to be kind of times when the for-profits come out looking all that good, and they haven't in the past in all of Harkin's stuff. And he, in fact, gave a floor speech last week that talked about the pain that for-profits for-profit recruiters have been taught to elicit from the students that they're trying to recruit, to really, you know, get them to feel vulnerable and then commit to enrolling at the for-profit college and taking out, getting Pell Grants and taking out loans. And so going forward, there's going to be more hearings. There's going to be some kind of legislation from Harkin and Dick Durbin and a couple of other liberal Democrats. And at the same time, there's also all this regulatory stuff going on. We still don't have the final regulation on gainful employment. You know, there's one part of it that was released back in the fall and is going to go into effect in the summer, but that's not the big metric thing that we've been, you know, horrified, that, you know, the for-profit sector has been horrified about, and a lot of nonprofit higher ed has been kind of like, well, as long as it's bad for the for-profits, if it's not terrible for us. We're okay with it. That's still on the horizon, supposedly in the next month or two coming out, but we're still waiting for that.
This is very highly anticipated. Melissa, some of you may have seen the other byline of Melissa Korn, who writes for Dow Jones. She and I were direct messaging the other day on Twitter, and she said, I'm afraid to go on vacation because the gainful employment rule might come out. I can assure you I'm going to go on vacation. But it is the thing that is looming the highest over the sector. The other thing that's out there now, and that this kind of is a great segue into sort of what it's been like to be covering this lately, is there's, in a way that we've never had before, there's at least 2 lawsuits right now. The Association of Private Sector Colleges and Universities, formerly known as CCA, sued the Education Department a couple weeks ago over a set of regulations that are set to go into effect this summer, which talk about things about executive compensation and recruiting, misrepresentation, and some of the other elements of the new regulation that we'd mentioned. So they're trying to challenge that. A new group called, the
Coalition for Educational Success.
Coalition for Educational Success, which is actually funded by some private equity-owned colleges.
Right. And their chief lobbyist is Lanny Davis, who you may have heard of because he was in the Clinton administration and has since kind of become a lobbyist for a lot of African dictators and other people like that. I mean, it's the way that Washington works, and this is kind of for a lot of people in higher ed, other than maybe it's the student loan stuff, this is really the first step into kind of the Washington lobbying world at its most aggressive and rich.
So that Coalition for Educational Success, they sued, the government, the entire federal government. They're claiming that there have been all these errors in the, everyone here heard about this GAO report, the undercover investigation of the for-profit colleges? I'm imagining most people here have seen that thing on TV reported. Well, there were a few errors in that report that the GAO acknowledged. The extent to which those errors were material or not is really up for debate, and that's another area where the coverage has gotten more complicated. There are some groups that are arguing and putting out reports saying the GAO erred in this way, and then there are other groups putting out reports saying, the GAO erred in this way, and then you can come back and say, well, that first report is not even really true because the second report is. It's just gotten. I kind of joke that it's a little bit down the rabbit hole of trying to follow the back and forth of what's going on, because there's a lot of lobbying and counter lobbying back and forth on these rules. I don't know. A lot of you are not in Washington, I imagine. So you may not have even seen this, and I know you can't see it from here, but this is a copy of a full-page ad that's been running in the Washington Post and a lot of other newspapers around the country.
Including mine, Politico.
And including, frankly, the Chronicle, so we're happy about that too sometimes. These are ads that are sort of complaining about the gainful employment rule, which I guess the simplest way to explain that is it will deprive federal aid to programs if students graduate with too high a debt load relative to what they could earn, or if they don't repay their loan, if too many students are not repaying their loans. So that's sort of it's a sort of a 2-part test. And that sounds easy. It's not as easy as that in the regulation, and that's part of the controversy.
Right.
Anyway, so there's been these ads. There have been, I stay up late and watch cable TV a lot at night. I watch The Daily Show. There have been ads. They've kind of calmed down now, I guess, but right till the end of the session last year, there was ads every night on The Daily Show complaining about the gainful employment regulation.
Yeah, and I watch cable news all day at work, and they're on all day at work. Washington is trying to take away your money for education, and that's kind of the trope that's been coming. And on either side of things, whether you're for-profit colleges or against them or something else, there's lots of little points to quibble with because this is so complicated. This is such an involved set of regulations. This is such a, there's no black and white in this overall world. There's a whole lot of gray.
And Jennifer mentioned something about the loan industry. I think I didn't cover the fights over direct lending and kicking the banks out of the loan program, but I know that was a very heated fight, and from everyone I've spoken to on the sector in higher education, this fight is kind of, to the 10th degree more intense than that, because it's sort of more far-reaching. At the end of the day, people knew that they were still going to get student loans one way or the other, but in some of these regulations, and particularly, again, back to this gainful employment regulation, there are a lot of colleges that are at least making it out to seem that it's going to really affect their businesses and their bottom lines, and so it's kind of a fight to the finish here. It's changed the way we cover things a lot. Some of you, I don't know how many of you are following this stuff. There's been a lot of noise about the role of short sellers in dominating the news, and the role of plaintiffs' attorneys in dominating the news and feeding reporters stories. Well, truth be told, reporters always got stories from lawyers. We always, lawyers would often call reporters, when they're working on a lawsuit and give you some background on it ahead of time. And of course, that's happening again now. The short sellers is probably a little more unusual in higher education.
Yeah, so if you're not familiar with the short seller thing, in just a little bit more detail, that's sort of people who make money off of stocks when their prices go down. And it was kind of the same guy who was behind this book by Michael Lewis called The Big Short, about kind of betting that the mortgage industry would collapse. Last year predicted that the for-profit colleges and student debt would be the next big debt crisis. And he is very influential in a lot of different spheres, including Washington. There are a lot of people on both sides of the aisle who take this guy, Steve Eisman's views very seriously, and a lot of other short sellers out there who are relatively prominent also are taken seriously by at least some people in Washington. And they're also, again, like the for-profit colleges, they have a lot of money and a lot of lawyers to figure out all the ways that they can strategize to get the federal government to do stuff that's going to help them make money, which in the case of short sellers means regulating the for-profit colleges tightly.
And of course, with the role of the short sellers, there has been the requisite amount of righteous outrage, which we're expected to cover also. Gosh, how dare the Congress listen to a short seller testify? Of course, if they hadn't listened to a short seller testify, there would have probably been just as much righteous outrage on the other side of people saying, this guy told you there was a problem and you refused to listen to him. Right. So, but the level of righteous outrage is quite enormous also.
On all sides.
On all sides, actually. The Education Department also has its level of righteous outrage, which it communicates pretty regularly to reporters.
Yes.
One thing that's also been interesting is I find as part of this reset, which to some degree you could take it for what it is or what it isn't. I don't know how, it's definitely out there. I don't know how sincere it is. Last week, about 50 of the regionally accredited colleges held a little, what they called a summit meeting up in New York City. At the Princeton Club to talk about ways that they could be a more constructive force in higher education, in American higher education. They talked a lot about having a lot more transparency.
But of course they didn't let
I would love to tell you more about the meeting, but I was barred at the door, so I can't really tell you that much about the transparency. But I can tell you that the library at the Princeton Club is lovely, but they wouldn't let me stay there either. So that's kind of that's sort of the level of where it is right now. There's a lot of thrust and parry about a lot of these issues.
I think we're going to take some questions, but let me just set the stage, because I know trustees and presidents say, what's the relationship between the private sector and not-for-profit? One of the things, just to set the tone, is the Secretary of Labor said the budget is shrinking, the resources are shrinking, and basically a lot of the proprietary and for-profit want access to public funds. And I think that's where the competition comes in. I know in my county, I just got a petition for ITT to come in and open up a school. Why are you worried about the competition? Because when people look at the outcomes, an ITT or a University of Phoenix can kind of shave off the top the better student. Graduation rates, placement rates are better. And then we're asked by the same Congress people, how come our graduation rates and placement rates aren't better? We have to have an open door policy, right? Also, the second thing is, and maybe the trustees should be asking themselves this, what kind of regulations do you have that restrict your college from being competitive with the for-profit schools? For example, I was told by my governor, I can't have a lobbyist in Washington. Right, using public funds. The for-profit, this place is flooded with lobbyists. for the institutions. So,
I do see David Boehm out there, so I know there are people in there.
okay, no. You're all right. What I'm saying is there's not 1,200 lobbyists here for community colleges. Okay, they can't do that. So we're going to take some questions from the audience now. Just line up at the microphone, and if you have a question, go ahead.
Yeah, one thing I was going to say is it's interesting when you go to meetings now with for-profits and they explain kind of what they do, the words you hear most often are, we're nimble, we're market sensitive, we can really, we react to business interests, we're very, we're very student focused. And those are all words that I know when I started covering higher education for the Chronicle. Those were the words I used to hear all the time and still hear all the time from the community colleges. Right. Although the difference now, I guess, is the community colleges are a lot more strapped for cash and the for-profit colleges are not.
Which is totally what the for-profits have been trying to take advantage of, and in their, promotions and recruiting students, they certainly say, well, you could go to that community college down the street, but you're not going to be able to get the classes you want, and even if you can, they're not going to be at the time that you want to take them, and you're not going to get the support that we would give you, and it's you're going to be in this crappy, disgusting building, and look at our state-of-the-art facility. And those are the kinds of things that are happening at one level. And then there's the other thing, which is the whole graduation rate thing. And I know we want to get to questions, but I just kind of wanted to address this very briefly, which is that when you get down to kind of comparing graduation rates, there are some statistics that came out a couple months ago that pegged the graduation rate for for-profit colleges for 2 years and less programs at about 60%, and for community colleges at about 25%. The problem with those numbers is that for-profit colleges are primarily producing certificate students. They're not producing associate degree students, which is the exact opposite of what community colleges are doing. And when you take into account that community colleges are also educating a lot of students who then transfer, and we've all talked about kind of the problems with graduation rates, especially for community colleges, because they don't really represent what you're actually doing with students and what you're actually achieving. But this is a tactic that the for-profits have been using increasingly over the last few months to kind of say, look at all the ways that the community colleges fail students and fail their communities, and look at the ways that we don't, which is really, if you see your local for-profits doing that, you should go and do some research on the statistics that they're using and figure out if there's a way that you can say, well, actually that's not the case and we actually are serving our students.
Yeah, I mean, their statistic is real, but it's a shorter program and it's frankly a more expensive program. Right. So but it may actually, to give the colleges their due, it may actually be an effective program. Right. People may want to get in and get out and get to work. Whether they're actually getting the jobs is a whole other question. That's been one of the harder things, particularly for us at the Chronicle, and I imagine at Politico. We're at the national level. We're not in the communities in quite the same way. So it's much harder for us to sort of see on the ground.